Have you ever wondered why we spend so much time and money trying to kill weeds when nature already invented a plant that does it for free? Today, we are going to talk about a gardening secret that might just blow your mind. I'm going to reveal two miraculous plants that not only kill every weed in their path, but also die and turn themselves into the highest quality fertilizer you could ever give your garden. And please, whatever you do, stop using black plastic mulch. I promise you, by the end of this video, you will never look at a roll of garden plastic the same way again. The truth is, the gardening industry has been lying to you about how to keep your garden weed-free. They want you dependent on plastic sheets and synthetic chemicals. But nature has a completely free, self-sustaining system. Let me know in the comments right now. Are you currently using plastic mulch to fight weeds, or are you pulling them by hand? Let us see which method is driving you crazy the most. To understand why these two plants are so revolutionary, we have to look at how we got here. Decades ago, large-scale agricultural companies introduced black plastic mulch as a miracle solution for weed control. The idea was simple. If you cover the ground with black plastic, weeds cannot get sunlight, and they die. This idea trickled down to everyday backyard gardeners. Suddenly, everyone was rolling out miles of petroleum-based plastic across their beautiful soil. But nobody talked about the long-term damage. Plastic blocks oxygen. It traps unnatural amounts of heat, baking the beneficial microbes in your soil alive. And worst of all, it slowly degrades into microplastics that end up right in the vegetables you feed your family. Before the invention of plastic, farmers relied on a concept called green manure, or living mulch. They used specific fast-growing plants to protect the soil, smother unwanted weeds, and feed the next generation of crops. We lost this ancient wisdom because buying a roll of plastic seemed faster. But today, we are bringing that knowledge back. Let us start by looking closely at the traditional weekend for a home gardener. You wake up early on a Saturday morning. The sun is shining warmly. You walk out to your vegetable patch with a cup of hot coffee in your hand. But instead of admiring your beautiful tomatoes or peppers, what do you see? Weeds. Hundreds of them, everywhere. They seem to have grown 2 inches overnight while you were sleeping. So, what is the standard advice everyone gives you? They tell you to roll out massive sheets of black plastic mulch to stop the madness. They tell you to cover your beautiful, living soil with a toxic petroleum product. People say it is the only practical way to block the sun and stop those weeds from taking over your garden beds. But let us really think about this for a minute. You are trying to grow healthy, organic food for your family to eat. Yet, you are wrapping your garden in a material that takes hundreds of years to break down. We have been completely brainwashed into thinking this is normal gardening behavior, but it is a complete disaster for your backyard ecosystem. The damage caused by plastic mulch goes much deeper than just looking ugly in your yard. When you lay down a solid sheet of black plastic, you are essentially putting a suffocating blanket over a living, breathing organism. Your soil is absolutely packed with life. There are billions of microscopic bacteria, beneficial fungi, earthworms, and insects that need oxygen and water to survive. Black plastic creates a barrier that stops rainwater from naturally soaking into the ground. Instead, the water runs off the sides, leaving the soil directly under your plants bone dry. Furthermore, during the peak of summer, that black color absorbs the intense heat from the sun. The soil temperature directly underneath can easily reach over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. At these extreme temperatures, the beneficial microbes literally cook to death. You are sterilizing your own garden without even realizing it. When the soil life dies, your plants become weak, and they start relying entirely on expensive chemical fertilizers just to survive. So what is the alternative to this plastic nightmare? The answer lies in a strategy called cover cropping, specifically using living mulches. Imagine a plant that grows so incredibly fast that it acts like a natural, living carpet over your soil. This brings us to the first of our two miracle plants. It is called buckwheat. Now, when I say buckwheat, you might immediately think of pancakes or noodles, but in the organic gardening world, buckwheat is known as a high-speed weed smothering machine. It is one of the fastest-growing broadleaf plants on the planet. From the moment you scatter the seeds onto the soil, buckwheat germinates in just 3 to 5 days if the weather is warm. Within 30 days, it is already flowering. Because it grows with such explosive speed, it completely outcompetes any weed seeds that are trying to wake up in your soil. The weeds simply cannot get enough sunlight, water, or space to survive against the aggressive growth of the buckwheat plant. Let us talk about exactly how buckwheat eliminates the competition. It is not just about growing tall quickly. Buckwheat produces large, wide leaves that spread out horizontally as the plant grows upward. These wide leaves act exactly like hundreds of tiny green solar panels. They capture absolutely all the available sunlight before it can ever reach the surface of the soil. By plunging the ground below into deep shade, the buckwheat prevents stubborn weed seeds from ever getting the light they need to perform photosynthesis. Think of it as a natural, living shade cloth. If a dandelion or crabgrass seed tries to sprout beneath a thick stand of buckwheat, it will simply starve to death in the darkness. This physical shading is just as effective as black plastic, but with one massive difference. The buckwheat is alive. It is actively pumping oxygen into the air, and its roots are gently breaking up the soil, allowing water and air to flow freely downward where it belongs. But buckwheat has another incredible trick up its sleeve, and it involves a fascinating scientific process called allelopathy. Allelopathy is a biological phenomenon where a plant produces specific biochemicals and releases them into the surrounding environment. These natural chemicals are essentially natural herbicides. As the buckwheat grows, its roots secrete these compounds directly into the soil. These compounds specifically inhibit the germination and root growth of competing plants, which are the weeds you are trying to get rid of. So the buckwheat is fighting a war on two fronts simultaneously. Above the ground, it is stealing all the sunlight with its massive leaves. Below the ground, it is releasing natural chemicals that tell weed seeds to stay asleep and not bother sprouting. It is a highly sophisticated, completely organic weed control system that nature perfected millions of years ago. You do not need to buy expensive, toxic weed killers in plastic jugs when you have this kind of biological warfare happening naturally. Now, let us address the second half of the promise in this video. How does this weed killer become a top-tier fertilizer? This is where buckwheat truly earns the title of a miracle plant. Buckwheat is what soil scientists call a phosphorus miner. Phosphorus is a critical nutrient that all plants need to produce strong roots, beautiful flowers, and abundant fruit. The problem is that in many gardens, phosphorus gets locked up deep in the soil, attached to minerals in a form that your vegetable plants simply cannot absorb. It is there, but it is entirely useless to your tomatoes or peppers. Buckwheat roots, however, are very special. They secrete mild organic acids that dissolve these locked-up minerals. The buckwheat drinks up this freed phosphorus and stores it inside its own leaves and stems. When the buckwheat plant dies and breaks down on the surface of your garden, all that hidden phosphorus is released back into the topsoil in a highly bioavailable form. Your vegetables can now easily absorb it and thrive. You might be wondering how to actually use this plant in a practical way without it becoming a weed itself. The technique is called chop and drop, and it is incredibly simple and satisfying to do. You plant the buckwheat seeds in any empty garden bed during the warm spring or summer months. You let it grow thick and lush for about 4 to 5 weeks. Right when you see the very first beautiful white flowers appear, that is your signal. You do not wait for it to make seeds. You simply take a pair of garden shears, a weed whacker, or even a sharp knife, and you chop the buckwheat down right at the soil level. You leave the chopped stalks and leaves laying exactly where they fall. This green material now becomes a natural mulch. As it sits there, earthworms will rush to the surface to eat it. The chopped buckwheat decomposes rapidly, usually within just a week or two, returning all that mined phosphorus and organic matter directly into the soil. You have successfully killed the weeds and fertilized the bed in one easy step. Let us look at a real-world example to make this perfectly clear. Imagine a home gardener named Sarah. Last year, Sarah tried to grow a patch of sweet corn, but the bed was completely overrun with invasive bindweed and tough crabgrass. She spent hours every single weekend on her hands and knees pulling weeds until her back ached. This year, instead of buying a heavy roll of black plastic, she decided to try the buckwheat method. In early June, she scattered buckwheat seeds thickly over the empty bed and lightly raked them in. Within just 3 days, a blanket of green emerged. By early July, the buckwheat was knee-high and blooming. She checked beneath the canopy, and the soil was completely bare of weeds. The bindweed was suffocated. She chopped the buckwheat down, let it sit on the surface for 10 days, and then planted her late summer crops right through the decomposing organic matter. Her soil was incredibly loose, rich, and completely weed-free. No plastic was harmed, and no back-breaking labor was required. While buckwheat is the absolute champion for fast summer weed control, what do we do when the weather turns cold? Buckwheat hates the cold and will die at the very first sign of frost. This is where our second miracle plant steps into the spotlight. Allow me to introduce you to hairy vetch. Despite its somewhat strange name, hairy vetch is a winter-hardy superhero for your garden. It is a trailing, vining legume that thrives in cool weather. While your neighbors are cleaning up their gardens in the fall and leaving the soil bare and exposed to harsh winter storms, you are going to plant hairy vetch. As the temperatures drop, this plant will slowly but steadily grow, creating a dense, tangled mat of green vines across your soil surface. This winter blanket protects your valuable topsoil from washing away in heavy rains and prevents fierce winds from blowing away your nutrients. But more importantly, it is setting a trap for the weeds that try to sprout in the early spring. The weed suppression power of hairy vetch is truly a sight to behold. When spring arrives and the ground begins to warm up, early season weeds like chickweed, henbit, and dandelions usually explode into growth. But if you have a thick carpet of hairy vetch covering your garden bed, those spring weeds do not stand a chance. The vetch vines intertwine with each other, creating a dense, nearly impenetrable physical barrier over the soil. Because it starts growing vigorously very early in the spring, long before most weeds can get established, it completely dominates the space. It shades out the soil entirely. Any weed seeds that manage to germinate under this thick green blanket will quickly run out of energy and die. The vetch aggressively takes over the real estate, ensuring that your garden bed remains pristine and ready for your summer vegetables without you ever having to pull a single weed or lay down a single inch of plastic. Now, let us talk about the fertilizer magic of hairy vetch. Remember how buckwheat was a miner of phosphorus? Well, hairy vetch is a factory that manufactures nitrogen out of thin air. Yes, you heard that correctly. Nitrogen is the most important nutrient for leafy green growth in your vegetables, and synthetic nitrogen fertilizer is incredibly expensive and environmentally damaging to produce. But the air we breathe is actually made up of 78% nitrogen gas. Most plants cannot use the nitrogen in the air. However, hairy vetch is a legume. It forms a highly specialized symbiotic relationship with a specific type of soil bacteria called rhizobia. These microscopic bacteria attach themselves to the roots of the hairy vetch and form tiny little pink nodules. Inside these nodules, the bacteria perform a biological miracle. They pull nitrogen gas straight out of the air and convert it into a solid, usable form that plants can consume. It is very common to hear a persistent myth in the gardening community when you talk about this topic. Many people will tell you that planting cover crops is too much work, and that these plants will just steal water and valuable nutrients away from your actual vegetables. They think of these plants as just another type of weed. Let us completely shatter that myth right now. While a cover crop like hairy vetch is actively growing, it is true that it is using some water and holding on to nutrients. But here is the critical part that the myth ignores. You do not leave the cover crop growing while your vegetables are growing. You terminate the cover crop before you plant your main harvest. The cover crop is acting like a biological savings account. It gathers nutrients that would have washed away in the winter rain and locks them up safely in its plant tissue. It is not stealing nutrients from the soil. It is rescuing them and saving them for your tomatoes to use later. The true magic happens when you terminate the hairy vetch in the late spring. Just like with the buckwheat, you use the chop and drop method. About 2 to 3 weeks before you want to plant your summer vegetables, you cut the vetch down at the base. You leave all those nitrogen-rich vines laying right on top of the soil as a thick, protective mulch. Meanwhile, below the ground, the roots start to decay. As those roots and bacterial nodules break down, they release massive amounts of pure, organic nitrogen directly into the root zone, where your new vegetable plants will soon be growing. Studies have shown that a healthy stand of hairy vetch can add the equivalent of over 100 pounds of pure nitrogen fertilizer per acre. This is a staggering amount of free fertility. Your tomatoes, peppers, and heavy-feeding corn plants will absolutely explode with deep green, vigorous growth, all fueled by the plant that spent the winter keeping the weeds away. Imagine the incredible synergy when you combine both of these miracle plants into a single, year-round system. You are essentially creating an impenetrable fortress against weeds and a perpetual fertilizer factory. Here is how it looks in practice. In the late spring, your garden beds are covered in the dying residue of the hairy vetch you chopped down. This residue acts as an organic mulch, suppressing summer weeds and slowly dripping nitrogen into the soil. You plant your heavy-feeding summer vegetables directly through this vetch mulch. As the summer progresses and your vegetables finish producing, you pull them out. Now, instead of leaving the soil bare to bake in the late summer sun, you immediately broadcast buckwheat seeds. The buckwheat races up, smothering any late summer weeds and mining phosphorus. Before the first frost, you chop the buckwheat down, leaving it on the soil surface, and then immediately broadcast hairy vetch seeds to start the winter cycle all over again. Let us take a moment to look at the financial breakdown of this biological system compared to the modern chemical-dependent method. If you follow the traditional advice, you have to drive to the hardware store and buy heavy rolls of black plastic mulch. Then you have to buy expensive bags of synthetic nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer. Over the course of 5 years, this can easily cost you hundreds of dollars just for a small backyard garden. On the other hand, buying a large bag of buckwheat seeds and a large bag of hairy vetch seeds will cost you a fraction of that amount. These seeds are incredibly cheap. Furthermore, the synthetic system damages your soil over time, requiring you to buy more and more products just to maintain the same results. The biological system, using our 2 miracle plants, actually improves your soil exponentially every single year. You're spending pennies on seeds to produce hundreds of dollars worth of premium organic fertilizer, all while saving hours of back-breaking weeding labor. Another massive benefit of using these two plants instead of plastic mulch is the dramatic improvement in your soil structure. When soil is covered by plastic, it becomes compacted over time because there are no living roots moving through it to keep it fluffy. Heavy rains beat down on the plastic, pressing the soil down beneath it. But when you use the root systems of buckwheat and hairy vetch, you are essentially hiring thousands of tiny biological plows. The roots push through the dirt, creating microscopic channels. When you chop the plants and the roots decay, those channels remain open. They become pathways for air and water to penetrate deeply into the earth. If you have heavy clay soil that feels like concrete in the summer, implementing this cover crop system is the fastest way to turn it into rich, crumbly loam. No rototiller or double digging is required. The roots do all the heavy lifting for you, completely silently and for free. We also need to talk about the absolute explosion of soil life that occurs when you switch from plastic to living mulches. Earthworms are the ultimate indicator of a healthy garden. They are nature's tiny fertilizer factories. When you lay down plastic mulch, earthworms tend to dive very deep to escape the extreme heat and the lack of moisture near the surface. They abandon the topsoil where your plants need them most. However, when you chop and drop a dense stand of buckwheat or hairy vetch, you are providing a massive all-you-can-eat buffet for the earthworms. As that green material begins to decay on the surface, the worms will rush upwards. They pull the decaying leaves down into their burrows, digest them, and leave behind worm castings. Worm castings are arguably the most nutrient-dense, perfectly balanced organic fertilizer on the planet. By growing these plants, you are intentionally farming earthworms right in your vegetable beds. Transitioning from the plastic mulch mindset to this biological approach does require a slight shift in how you plan your garden. The biggest mistake beginners make is waiting too long to chop down the cover crops. Timing is very important. If you let buckwheat grow too long, it will produce hard black seeds. If those seeds fall to the ground, the buckwheat itself will become a weed in your next crop. The absolute golden rule for buckwheat is to chop it down exactly when you see the first big flush of white flowers. Do not wait. For hairy vetch, you want to chop it down when it is in full purple bloom, usually in late spring. At this stage, the plant has fixed its maximum amount of nitrogen, but its stems are still soft enough to decompose rapidly. If you wait until the vetch produces mature seed pods, the stems become woody and tough, and they will take much longer to break down into the soil. Managing the timing is the only real work involved. So how can you start doing this in your own backyard this weekend? If you have an empty garden bed right now, or a section of your yard that is completely taken over by annoying weeds, do not reach for the weed killer, and do not go buy plastic. First, manually cut the existing weeds down as close to the soil as possible. Rough up the surface of the dirt just a little bit with a steel rake. Then, take a handful of buckwheat seeds and scatter them very densely over the entire area. You want to throw the seeds down so thickly that it looks like someone spilled a box of cereal. Lightly rake the seeds into the top half-inch of soil and give it a good watering. Within just 5 days, you will see a solid carpet of green emerging. You have just taken your very first step into the world of advanced organic soil building. You have initiated a biological process that will transform that weed-infested patch into incredibly fertile, ready-to-plant soil in just over a month. The long-term compound effect of using this system is nothing short of miraculous. By constantly cycling fast-growing summer plants like buckwheat and nitrogen-fixing winter plants like hairy vetch, you are relentlessly increasing the organic matter in your soil. Every single time you chop and drop, You are adding a fresh layer of carbon and nutrients to the surface. Over the course of 3 to 5 years, your topsoil will become noticeably darker, softer, and more spongy. It will hold water like a giant sponge during summer droughts, and it will drain perfectly during heavy spring rains. You will notice that weed pressure naturally drops to almost zero because your garden beds are never left bare and exposed for weed seeds to land on. You will have built a self-sustaining, deeply resilient ecosystem.
Your vegetable yields will skyrocket, and the flavor of your organic produce will be unmatched. All because you decided to ditch the plastic and partner with nature. But what is truly the biggest plot twist in all of this? For decades, we were told that to have a neat, productive garden, we had to sterilize it. We thought we had to cover it in black plastic and fight a never-ending war against nature using brute force. The shocking truth is that our obsession with total control was the exact thing slowly killing our gardens. By stepping back and letting these two miracle plants, buckwheat and hairy vetch, do what they have evolved to do over millions of years, we unlock a level of fertility and ease that plastic could never provide. We transition from being fighters to being facilitators. We finally realize that the soil is a living organism, and the best way to stop bad plants from growing is simply to grow good plants faster and smarter. Thank you so much for watching and learning how to build a better, healthier garden. If this video changed your perspective on weed control, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with a fellow gardener. Now, I want to hear from you. Which of these two cover crops are you going to try planting first? The summer buckwheat or the winter hairy vetch? Let me know down in the comments below, and let us get a great discussion started.